Okay, I think we should begin now. I'm Aisha Phoenix, and welcome to this Newham Council Black History Month event on understanding colourism in the UK. It's wonderful to have so many of you here today. First of all, just to give you a brief idea of my background, I conducted the first major sociological study on colourism in the UK with Nadia Craddock, who's also here today, which is wonderful. I've written about colourism for a number of years, both journal articles and journalistic articles as well. I've featured in podcasts and documentaries on colourism, and I've also done some consultancy on colourism. So today, what I'm going to begin by doing is exploring what colourism is and where it comes from. Now, I imagine that there are people here with quite a lot of lived experience and perhaps academic experience of colourism, but there might also be people who don't have so much knowledge about it. So it's going to be an introductory, an introduction to colourism, but in the discussion, it'd be great if we can share ideas and develop ideas around the issue. So I'm going to think about why does colourism matter, then explore colourism in the media, colourism in gender, and then open up for a discussion. And I would really hope that many people feel able to share their views and ask questions as they see fit. After that, I'll share some of the findings from the Colourism in the UK study that Dr. Nadia Craddock and I have conducted. And then we'll have another Q&A and hopefully another discussion based on that as well. So what is colourism? Colourism, which is also sometimes called shadeism or skin tone bias, is prejudice in which people of colour with light skin are privileged over those with darker skin. Colourism can occur both within and between racialised groups. Some scholars argue that colourism also includes the privileging of those with phenotypical features that are closest to whiteness. So this slide here just gives you a sense of how international and how global the issue of colourism is. You've got academic articles on colourism in Canada, in Latin America, in India, in South Africa, Tanzania, the Caribbean, the United States, the African diaspora, South and Southeast Asia as well. So it just gives you a snapshot of just how global the issue of colourism is. Similarly, here you've got some news articles about colourism. So you've got this one on the right, Asia's addiction to whiter skin runs deep, but the backlash has begun, talking about the skin whitening market in China, Malaysia, the Philippines, and South Korea. You've got articles about colourism in South Korea and K-pop, colourism in India and Bollywood, colourism in the Middle East, in the Caribbean, in West Africa. It really is a global issue. So in terms of the history of colourism is a global issue and it has different histories in different parts of the world. For this Black History Month event, my focus will be on colourism amongst Black people, but it's much, much broader than that. For the descendants of transatlantic slaves, colourism dates back to the preferential treatment given to those with light skin who were conceived when white slave masters raped Black slaves. And then those slaves who had light skin were often given jobs that were more favourable, allowed to work in the home. So there was a hierarchy then amongst slaves, with the lightest skin treated better than those with darker skin who were out in the fields. In the US, white supremacist ideology constructed Black people as inferior to white people and lighter skin as preferable to darker skin. Colourism among Black Africans was exacerbated by colonialism. However, some scholars argue that it predated that. Evelyn Glenn argues that colourism in Southern Africa is just one of the negative inheritances of European colonialism. The ideology of white supremacy that European colonists brought included the association of Blackness with primitiveness, lack of civilization, unrestrained sexuality, pollution, and dirt. Some historians and anthropologists have argued that pre-colonial African conceptions of female beauty favoured women with light brown, yellow, or reddish tints. If so, the racial hierarchies established in areas colonised by Europeans cemented and generalised the privilege attached to light skin. So in other words, Evelyn Glenn is arguing that colourism already existed in those locations and it was exacerbated by the white privilege that came from colonialism and and therefore it became much, much worse as a result of that, but it was already there. And in other countries that don't have a history of colonialism or slavery, there is some arguments that there was already colorism due to the fact that those with lighter skin were seen to be those who could work in at home, who could stay indoors, didn't have to work out in the fields, therefore they had more status and they were seen as more valuable. So why is colorism important? You probably have noticed that in recent months and also recent years, there's been a much, much more discussion about colorism. Why does it matter? Colorism, like racism and other forms of prejudice, is unjust. It has an impact on life chances, self-esteem, and mental health for people of color. It's also lucrative, which makes it very difficult to challenge. Multinational companies exploit the prejudice to sell skin lightening products, and globally, the skin lightening industry is worth billions of pounds. So let's explore the effects of colorism on life chances. Lots of the research on colorism has come out of the United States, so I'll refer to different US studies in this section. So African Americans with lighter skin are more likely to have higher status occupations, higher incomes, and more years of schooling than those with darker skin. They are also more likely to live in better neighborhoods and marry people with a higher status than those from the same ethnicity who have darker skin. In terms of the criminal justice system, people of color with darker skin shades get longer sentences than those with lighter skin shades for the same crimes. African American men with dark skin have lower occupational status jobs, which may be the result of educational and recruitment inequities as well. Thinking about the effects of colorism on education, Margaret Hunter argues that the education gap between white and Black students was nearly the same as that between students with light and dark skin. It's worth pausing for a second to think about what that means. So thinking about people are more aware of issues to do with racism and institutional racism in education and Black students' attainment gaps, but thinking about the fact that the gap between people within the same ethnicity who have light and dark skin is as big, is really significant. Colorism amongst US teachers linked to high expectations for those with light skin and low expectations for those with dark skin has an impact on students' performances, with students either working hard to make sure they fulfill their teachers' expectations or stop not working particularly hard and doing worse than they would have done because their teachers don't expect much of them. Students of color may consider those with light skin to be more beautiful, intelligent, and to have higher social status, though they may be deemed lacking in ethnic authenticity. So let's talk briefly about identities before thinking about colorism and identities. Identities are relational, co-created by individuals and by others. They can function as points of identification and attachment only because of their capacity to exclude, to leave out, to render outside. Identities affect feelings of belonging to families and social groups. Kimberlé Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality recognizes simultaneous positioning in social categories, e.g., one has a gender, class, sexuality, and ethnicity. One is in all those social categories at the same time. People have many different coexisting identities. They're not fixed or singular. They're socially constructed and highly complex. So when we think about colorism and identities, colorism affects identity construction for people of color, as those with darker skin shades, particularly women, can be made to feel inferior, while those with light skin are privileged. While privileged Black and mixed race people of color with light skin can also feel excluded from Blackness and alienated, which we'll explore later on in this talk. Colorism affects men's identities too, having an effect on self-esteem, confidence, and desire. And Dr. Parek and my research on colorism in the UK explored this, and we'll discuss that in the second part of this talk. So one area where people are particularly aware of the effects of colorism is in advertising, where white beauty ideals and light skin, thin lips, and straight hair are prioritized, particularly for women. Women with medium and dark skin tones have had their skin digitally lightened in adverts and magazines, and there's been a lot of complaints about that over the years. Editors and brands often fear that Black women will harm sales. The then editor of British Vogue, Alexandra Schulman, said, "The evidence suggests that Black cover girls don't sell as well as white cover girls, and people of color are routinely not selected for the covers of many broad circulation magazines for fear they will depress newsstand sales." Now, one example of the controversy caused by this was the picture of Lupita Nyong'o on the cover of Vanity Fair. you can see that she's on the right-hand side of the screen. She's very pale compared with the picture of her on the left, which has got her rich dark skin that's the same as we'd see in Black Panther or her other movies. And so she was upset by this, and many other people were upset by the idea that in order to be on the front cover, they felt the need to lighten her skin. And Beyonce was accused, as you can see in the other picture, of lightening her skin for album promotion ads, suggesting that she was also aware that lighter skin might lead to better sales, and therefore she looks much paler in that picture than she does in many other instances when she's seen publicly. So thinking about colorism in the media, in these family sitcoms, who gets to perform which roles? And I wondered if you could just make some comments in the chats about what you observe if you look at these pictures. 4 of them, the top left one is from Blackish, the one at the bottom left is from Raising Dion, which was on Netflix, and then you've got Casey, you've got Casey Undercover, and then Family Reunion, and then 2 older shows, Sister Sister and My Wife and Kids. What do you notice about the people who are the father figures, the men in the pictures, and the women who are the mother figures in those pictures? I can't actually see the chat, so if anyone's written anything, if Lynette could read it out, that'd be perfect.
The people aren't writing in the chat. Oh, mother figures are lighter, somebody says. Anne. I noticed that as well. Does anybody else have anything that they'd like to put in the chat? Or maybe you can unmute yourselves and say it if you would feel more comfortable to do that.
Yes, that was the first thing I noticed, that the men were much darker than the women.
Yes, yeah, that's a really good observation. And that's what I was hoping people might be able to spot in those pictures. So thinking about that again, so this is just a screen which shows a clearer idea of who's in those different shows. So you've got the Blackish actress at the top, and then the mother in Casey Undercover next to her, and next to her, the mother in Family Reunion. And they all have one white parent, so they're all mixed race. And then at the bottom, the other 3, Alicia Wainwright, Jackie Harry, and Tisha Campbell, have all got very light skin, although they're not mixed race. And the men on the right hand side, each of them seems considerably darker. So it's seen, for the women to be seen as attractive, they need to have very pale skin and loose curls, and the men, it's okay for them to be darker. So it shows the gendered aspects of colorism.
And I'd also think the children, the girls tend to be similar to the mothers in terms of, if you look at the girls,
yes,
the females have the girls have long hair. This one in Blackish, in the yellow t-shirt, she's got slightly similar complexion to her mum, a bit darker, but long hair.
Yeah.
And then the 2 girls in Sister Sister, clearly, they've got the hair and the skin tone. But the boys, in contrast, seem to be like the fathers, quite dark.
I think that's a really good observation, because that's largely the case. So in Casey Undercover, the son has got dark skin like his father, exactly. Dion has got much darker skin than his mother. Yeah, I think that's a really good. And in My Wife and Kids as well, the son has got much darker skin than his sisters. So that's a really important observation. And again, it underlines the same thing, that the gendered aspects of colorism. So thinking now about colorism in film, some of you might have heard of the book The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. And that was a popular young adult novel which explores issues to do with race and racialization. The character in the book was described in this way: it's as if God mixed my parents' skin tones in a paint bucket to get my medium brown complexion. And you can see the way in which the illustrator, Deborah, I've forgotten her surname, but Deborah has drawn her with, and this actress is, the character is called Star, has drawn Star with pretty dark skin. Now, in the movie version, how would you compare the book cover to the Star who's in the movie of the film, the movie of the book? Again, if you could either unmute yourselves and share your views, or just write in the chat.
And there were some other comments that people put in. Men are always darker skinned and the women are usually lighter. The man tends to be dark skinned and the wife is always lighter, going back to the Cosby Show. And I always said that children are always light skinned. So those are some of the comments from the previous So it's the same observation, really.
That's really good. And I think that's really important to recognise. And also that the fact that historically, so the Cosby Show, when I was little, I used to watch that the same issues are being reproduced now.
And I think here that the person on the right, has got an afro hair, and she's clearly brown skinned. And this young woman on the left, she's clearly paler skinned.
Yes, exactly. And she's actually a mixed race actress playing this black character. Her name is Amanda Stenberg. So on this slide, it's interesting to explore what the illustrator Deborah Cartwright had to say about the casting. She said, "I wasn't exactly thrilled because of the colorism in Hollywood. I was hoping it would be a very brown-skinned actress because there's so little opportunities in these big movies for darker-skinned actresses. It's disheartening because I do feel like so much money was thrown behind the movie and so much marketing was thrown behind it. And it's just like you can tell who Hollywood is pushing to be in the limelight. It was a very specific description in the book. And to see that the actress is not that description, that would annoy me as a reader." And she says, particularly if she were a young child watching the film. And so what's interesting on the left-hand side of the screen, you've got the actress Amanda Stenberg talking about colorism. So she says, "This conversation on colorism has been coming up, and I've had to recognize and be vocal as a responsibility around being lighter skinned and biracial and the accessibility that affords me." So I think she's recognizing that she was cast in the role because she's a very talented actor. She does a really good job in the film, but she also recognizes that she also was helped along by the fact that she has light skin. She said, "It's good to recognize privilege, but sometimes it does hurt to feel like I'm not fully accepted by my own community. Where else am I going to go? I live a black experience. I walk out of my door every day black, and that's how the world sees me."
I mean, there's another few interesting comments. Somebody's said, looked back historically and saying Zoe Saldana playing Nina Simone in a film.
We're coming right up to that right now. So yeah, that's a good point. What did they say about that, by the way?
It just says that, actually Zoe was much less self-aware. The comment was that the part reminds me of Zoe Saldana playing Nina Simone. Actually, Zoe was much less self-aware. And then there's another point. It's very noticeable, the contrast, and complementing the example that was given.
Yeah, I think
and then the point that the character in the film is lighter skinned as per the stereotypes of the film industry. So just calling the whole film industry into question in terms of how they perpetuate it.
Yeah, and it really does. It really does. And it's being challenged now. And there are lots of powerful directors, well, not lots, but there are important directors who are black and who are challenging these issues. And Black Strong Lead as well on Netflix is trying to challenge these things, but they're big issues. So I'm glad someone mentioned Zoe Saldana, because that's something that I wanted to discuss now. I think it's really important. She was cast to play Nina Simone in the 2016 biopic. However, Zoe Saldana's got very light skin, a thin nose, straight hair, and doesn't look anything like Nina Simone. You can see from the picture of the two side by side. And when there was a lot of upset about this, including from Nina Simone's family, about her being cast for this role, she said, "You have no idea who I am black." And she just defended herself and was very angry about the criticism rather than reflecting on why perhaps people weren't happy with it. And if you look at the picture in The Guardian of her, she's wearing a prosthetic nose and she's had her skin darkened. So effectively she's been blackened up to play the role.
Oh, wow.
And she doesn't recognize at the time that that's a problem. But recently, as you see from the top there, she's tearfully apologized for playing that role. She recognized that she was not the right person to be cast. And if she had been, then she wouldn't have needed to have her skin blacked up and she wouldn't have needed a prosthetic nose. So I think she has grown in self-awareness, which is good. And it's good that she's able to come out and say, I think I made a mistake there, and recognize the issues with it. But it was very upsetting at the time.
Can I just ask a question, Aisha? Do you think, though, that possibly her decision to take the role could have been to do with money? I mean, obviously it's an opportunity and she's an actress. I think sometimes it's a very thin line between politics and, the real hard cold cash. She's an aspiring actress. She's been given an opportunity to play this role. I don't know.
Well, I think you're right. I think many people take roles for all sorts of reasons that they might not completely feel comfortable with or not really want to interrogate because they want to benefit financially from it. But if you look at an actor like the late Chadwick Boseman, who was very principled, is that correct? Yeah, I hope that's
Yeah.
He was very principled and very, very careful about the roles he chose. I think it's we can't just let someone off and say, oh, they wanted the money, because where's the ethics in that? I think it's, if you're literally going to be blacked up to play a role, you have to think ethically about whether or not you're comfortable with that. And she chose that, she made that decision. I hope it's not one she'd make again. So we've also got actresses. So Zendaya, who was one of the characters we saw on a few screens ago in Casey Undercover, she's recognized that as a mixed race woman, that she's seen as more acceptable. She's the more acceptable version of a black girl in Hollywood because she's got one white parent. And previously, she's also talked about having privilege compared with her darker sisters and brothers. And she says, can I honestly say that I've had to face the same racism and struggles as women with darker skin? No, I cannot. And Matthew Knowles, who's the father of Beyonce, has suggested that his daughter may have benefited from colorism, while her friend and former Destiny's Child co-star Kelly Rowland was disadvantaged by it. Pride magazine's entertainment and features editor said, the Beyoncés, the Rihannas, obviously they have incredible talent, but their lighter skin has been an advantage in getting them as far as they've gone. And recently, in light of the murder of George Floyd in the US by a white police officer and the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement and the energizing of that movement, you've had stars with dark skin coming out to talk about their experiences of colorism. For example, Beverly Knight, the singer, said she was maybe too dark for success in the music industry, and it was easier to market someone who was much lighter with more European features. And Alexandra Burke, who won the X Factor in 2008, said that after that success, she was told to bleach her skin and that she shouldn't have an afro or braids. And a record label told her she needed to smile more because you come across aggressive, which is conforming to these racist stereotypes about the angry black woman, which are exacerbated by people with dark skin shades. It's noteworthy that it is women of colour who have spoken out about their experiences, which points to the gendered impact of colorism. So to talk now about colorism and gender more, racism and colorism lead to the privileging of light skin and patriarchal patterns of desire, mean women are still judged disproportionately on their looks. Although colorism affects both men and women, patriarchy and sexism help explain why artists like Beverly Knight and Alexandra Burke have been particularly affected by the prejudice. Women with dark skin are at a disadvantage because skin shade is central to assessments of beauty, with light skin operating as a form of symbolic capital that is converted into economic capital, an advantage in the heterosexual market. So now let's open up for a discussion. If you can unmute yourselves and we can just talk about some of the issues of colorism that the talk has raised, or more broadly, that would be great. We've got about 20 to 25 minutes for discussion now, and then we'll move on to the second part of the talk. So if any comments or questions, and also if you have any experiences of colorism you'd like to share, or if you've noticed colorism or even perpetuated it yourself, you might not want to talk about yourself, but you could say, I know somebody who has, and then describe a scenario if you feel like it.
Well, I'm from Barbados, and when I was a little girl, it was only children like...
Oh. Hello? Sorry, I think you cut out there. Could you repeat what you were saying? Can anyone hear? I can't hear anything.
No, we can't hear her. Could anyone else like to speak while we're waiting for...
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes. Perfect.
Yes.
Yes, okay. I'm saying when I was a little girl in Barbados, children of my color, lighter or white Bajan children, were accepted in the choir. I didn't know at the time that that was colorism, but I accepted it. And that type of colorism at that time in Barbados was so ingrained that I had a very dark-skinned cousin whom my friends, my associates, my peers didn't know about. Anyway, that girl had come down from the country, and I took her to one of the exhibitions that we had in Barbados at the park. I was about 11, and one of my friends came up and she said, who is that black girl? And I immediately said, without thinking, oh, she's my maid's daughter. And of course, when
Oh,
my when the girl got to my mom's house, she told my mother. My mother told me off. But this is what my mother said. She smacked me and she said, "But you shouldn't have said that in front of her." So even my mother, I was getting those colorism things from my mother. Of course, growing up and then coming to England and then realizing, because at the time in Barbados, people of my complexion were just called red people. So when I came to England and realized that I was black, that was really an insult. But now I've gone the opposite way. I am really for black people, for Africans, I want to be an African, and things like that. But that's beside the point. I have actually researched colorism both in England and in Barbados in 2018 for my dissertation. I did a dissertation in anthropology, BA anthropology. And believe you me, I did not think that I would have found so much colorism in Bristol. I interviewed 22 people altogether, 11 in Bristol and 11 in Barbados. And it is very strong in Bristol, but people don't talk about it. And of course, it still happens in Barbados. It happens in shops. Sometimes people don't even recognize it until you probe it. Some of the people that I actually interviewed in Barbados, oh no, we don't experience that. And when I said, well, have you ever been in a shop and you're ignored? Oh yes, that has happened to me. One gentleman who I actually interviewed, he is very dark, but he's very well educated. He owns a firm. He's a manager of a firm. And he said to me, when he goes to restaurants in Barbados that the owners and the staff don't know him, they would immediately take the menu to his red, light
oh
skin
wow.
employees and say, "Oh, sir, this is what we have today," totally ignoring him because he is black and he's the one paying. He's taking his employees out. You know,
Wow.
he came.
You said something quite interesting. You said when you came to the UK, you realized you were black.
Well, I didn't realize because people called me black. And I was really upset about it because I was never called black in Barbados. I was called red. So,
Oh,
so yeah. So it was a different thing. Of course, now, I mean, I've totally gone the opposite way. I married to an African first, and that upset my mother. She cut me out of her will because I went and married a black
oh.
African. You know, she cut me out of her will, but that's another story. But now I am for African. I want to be called African. And I'm doing everything possible. I'm even studying Black humanities to know more about the Black side of my history. Yeah.
So we have a comment here from Natasha. Sorry, I should really attribute people's comments. Sorry, everyone who I haven't before. But she says, I notice America prevails slots in colorism due to high profile movies and music videos that are promoted. So I think this question is, or this comment is about the way that this colorism is perpetuated via the music videos and and obviously the high profile films. Um, and I think that the other thing that I wanted to say that the previous caller, I think within our families, I think we've got the experiences. I know that certainly in my family we have six siblings. I have six siblings, and the ones my sister is quite a lot fairer than me, and you definitely notice that people gravitate and favor, and she's referred to as the red one or the brown one. So I don't know if anybody else has had that kind of similar thing within families. Okay, so somebody's got quite a interesting long. Let me see what this says. Um, oh,
While you're
some
reading that, can I just quickly ask you, Linda, did you publish your research on colorism? Be very
No, I have got it there. I'm actually doing my thesis now for my master's, and I'm progressing on that because that research was to find out is colorism is in Britain, is it still existing in Barbados, for instance? So I've
right.
done that and I've proved that. So now my thesis is to look at ways of how to address this, probably through education and other things. So I'm partway through my thesis at the moment with colorism. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So that's fantastic. Let's see what other people have been saying in the chat.
well, so there's somebody who's Jill, who says that she's a white woman, and she's saying that in 1965 she's working at a a large advertising agency as a secretary, and she was asked to type some copy that horrified her, and there was a jingle for soap. I don't know, I remember this soap actually. Be a little lovelier each day with wonderful pink Camay. I don't know if anyone remembers Camay. I remember that. And the thing was, but I was given the type was being a little lovely. I asked whether it was a mistake and was told no, it's for African market. It's for the African market. Um, I was asked whether it was a mistake. Sorry, I'm just going down a bit further. And she said she resigned, um, but she doesn't know. We don't know how to combat it. And she said, I've learned how to challenge this in the decades since. So she's actually used that experience, and now she challenges when she hears that. So that's like a conscious thing, though, isn't it? I think there's a debate around white people being more proactive in challenging these things, and when they come across them.
I don't think you can racialize it in that way. I think there's some people from all ethnicities challenge colorism, and I think now you're finding that many more people are feeling able to do so and speaking out about it, which is really important.
And people are remembering Camay. Somebody's granny used to use it. Diane's granny used to use Camay. I do remember that ad.
But I'd be interested if anyone feels comfortable either saying out loud or typing how they feel when they see the kind of colorism that I highlighted in those family sitcoms, if it has an impact on them or their self-perceptions or what their feelings about UK society. Obviously, those sitcoms are from the US, but obviously the similar colorism does exist in the UK in the same way. So does it have an impact on anyone?
I think I've I've come across friends who have been darker than their siblings and have been referred to as the black sheep, have been referred to as ugly, whereas other siblings are referred to as pretty. And I think it's a really painful, it's come across as a really painful experience that they're talking about it in their 40s and 50s. So it's not something that they've ever recovered from. And it's labeling as a child.
Yeah.
I think it's really, it's difficult to witness, and it's difficult to come up with the words, the right language to be able to say that, you know, I'm really sorry for your pain.
Yes. Because yes, you described it, it's kind of a scarring that happens when because people often have experienced colorism from a younger stage, and often it's family members or friends who've been colorist towards them. And what do you do then when there are people that are supposed to love you who are making you feel inferior because of the very shade of your skin? It's very difficult.
Do we think it's a conscious thing, though? Do we think that we've become so accustomed to accepting it that we don't actually challenge it or even acknowledge it? If you're the beneficiary of lighter skin privilege, how do you like the instant reaction that was expressed earlier on, that she immediately distanced herself from the darker relative? I mean, is it something that people are conscious that they do? We have a few more comments. Colorism also occurs in families, Yulinda says. One man I interviewed told me of the negative experience he had educationally, socially, etc., compared to his light-skinned brother, who was very privileged.
Yeah, it does happen, and families can be very overt about the fact that some children are uglier than others based upon skin shade, and that's solely what it's based upon, and it's extremely painful. Your comment about how conscious it is, I think it depends on people's political awareness and their knowledge about the kind of prejudice. Some people are very well versed in colorism and know it exists and challenge it, and others perhaps aren't aware that they're reproducing it. They might just literally think that, well, my daughter's prettier, my older daughter's prettier than my younger daughter, she has light skin, but it's just generally she's prettier. They might not be able to recognize that the reason they're attributing beauty to one and another one is uglier is because of that internalized prejudice. So for some people it's internalized, whereas for others some people might be aware that they're doing it, but think that's just because people with light skin are better, and others criticize and challenge it. It really depends from family to family.
By the way, I forgot to mention, and it's really bad of me, that this is being recorded. If you don't want your face to be shown, you can make your comments, but you can turn your screen off. So that's just in case people feel inhibited to speak because they don't want anyone to see their faces. So you can turn your camera off if you like.
Okay, hello, hi. My name is Sonia. I'm from London, and I was interested in that thing about colorism within the family. My father's very dark skin, and my mother's very light skin, and as they say, and I have two siblings who are dark, and there's three of us who are light, like mother. Mother tends to prefer the oldest because he's dark, and the youngest and she's dark. So I don't know. I'm just wondering, has anybody got any pointers on that?
So do you think do you have, what, before anyone else speaks about it, do you have a view on what that might have been about yourself?
I only think that it's because the firstborn and the lastborn. Firstborn
Right.
is obviously a triumph, and the lastborn.
Oh, you've muted yourself. We can't hear you anymore.
Yeah, sorry. The firstborn is obviously a triumph, and the lastborn is obviously the baby. So it might, and the three in between are light skin, like mother.
And what was the gender of was the gender the same?
So the firstborn is a male and he's dark, and the lastborn is a female and she's dark.
Right. So it could well be that, like you said, because you know your family, so it could well be the fact that it's the oldest child and the youngest child and those are favoured. It could also perhaps be a political move against recognising that society will favour the other three because they have light skin, and wanting to make sure that those two children with darker skin know that they are really fiercely loved. So it might be the mother loves all of you, but she wanted to make it very clear to the two with darker skin as well that they were particularly cherished in a world that's going to recognise them as inferior to their siblings. So that could also be something.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I like that point. And also, I also thought that it might be just because she loved father. That was her chosen mate, and he was dark. So that's another view.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, though. Yeah, I think that's really interesting to think about and explore.
Thank you very much for letting me bring that up.
That's great.
That's really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
So we've got a few more comments in the chat. I have friends in it. So Ruth says, I have friends in the US who have told me they feel Barack Obama and Kamala Harris have been more accepted by the general population, white and black, because they are light-skinned black people. It would be interesting to find research on this, but sadly, I expect there won't be much. I expect there is much truth in it.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, because there were lots of people talking about this at the time when Barack Obama was elected, that if he'd had darker skin, that he would not have been, because he's seen as more palatable, because he's closer to white beauty ideals, to white ideals about who is acceptable and who isn't, and he's seen as also less threatening because of that. So I think there's probably validity in that statement. It's a shame, but if you look at people who do have success, for example, some people have been thinking around the marriage of Prince Harry to Meghan Markle and saying if she'd had darker skin, it's very unlikely that she'd have been accepted into the family. And even with her light skin, she's received such horrible racism and prejudice. Imagine if she'd had dark skin, would that match have even been possible? And would she have been seen as attractive enough to be a possible match? Who knows? But colorism definitely does have an impact.
I think it's interesting that you raised Meghan Markle, because as an actress, as a mixed race actress, she would have had experiences of privilege because of her skin tone. But coming to the UK, there would have been a reversal of her experience, in that the UK, as far as the UK population was concerned, just a hint of blackness meant that she was a target. And that privilege would have turned round.
Well, I think she would have been privileged as someone who is mixed race in the UK. But when you then go to the institution of the royal family...
Absolutely, that's what I mean.
Yeah. Definitely, definitely. So that must have been quite a shock to her. I think there've been discussions around her friends mentioning that it would be tough, but I don't think anyone could have prepared her for just how awful it has been, because she's been trolled, she's been vilified, she's been subjected to vile abuse. And I've seen her in a film where she's played someone who was white, so she actually can pass as white. But because people know that she's got a black mother, they're really out to get her.
There's a few more comments in the chat. Yolinda agrees with Ruth. She also feels that the Bristol mayor got his role because he is a biracial man. And would he have got the role if he had had a black complexion? And then another comment is from Fui. Not everyone is self-aware of their colorism, in my experience. It's a legacy of colonial miseducation, as well as people not being able to provide support to family members who have a colonialist view. For some people, it's too traumatic to reflect on the views of colorism. So that's quite an interesting. And then there's one more. I agree with the previous comment about music videos. In the 80s and 90s, there were women of all shades, but here there's only more focus on lighter, racially ambiguous women with good, in inverted commas, hair.
And those are both really important points. And I think that the Freeze point about the trauma that people have when it comes to talking about colorism is a really important one, because I suppose if you've been used to perpetuating it, to have to interrogate what that actually means and what it means about perhaps people themselves. For some people, it's not only people who have lighter skin who express colorist views to those with darker skin. People with darker skin do that as well. And if you then interrogate what you're actually doing, then how does it make you feel about yourself? It's that kind of can create quite a difficult identity questions, and it raises a lot of issues. And it can also be divisive in families if you start to explore those things. It's important that it's done, but it's extremely painful. And I think the point about music videos is a very good one. I think you could have a whole talk about colorism in music. It's really apparent, and it's a very big issue. One of the things that is quite refreshing to see is that you've got some artists now, one called Getz and I think Lioness as well, have spoken about colorism in some of their music, and it's getting more attention. But even in that, both of them have darker skin, but Getz as a man is getting much more attention than Lioness as a woman. And so there's questions again around whether colorism is also having an impact on how they're able to have their voices heard when they're critiquing it in their music.
Oh, there's a few more. There was an interesting comment about hair and racism. So somebody says, but a fresh comment is I get annoyed when I go to Colombia and the carnival queen is Baracola. In Baracola is always very light skinned. When Baracola, I'm sorry, I'm not saying the name of the place right, has people of all colors. So I think that's again with about black people, white people being or paler skin being, if the society is mixed, why is it always the fair skinned person that gets that role? And then somebody says, agree, we need to talk about trauma. Somebody wants to talk about trauma. I am Chinese and have just a little bit lighter than my sister. My skin color was praised a lot at home in the UK and by relatives in Malaysia. Growing up, I alternated between feeling proud and lucky and feeling wrong about the praise. I think my sister and I grew up internalizing this prejudice, and it's one of the many difficult things we have probably repressed talking about. Um, I don't know that my family are teachable on this matter, but I choose vocally and critically now, opposed to accepting it silently. Internalizing is the first step to normalizing, and it soon becomes a given truth.
That's a really powerful comment from How You. I think it's really important to reflect on what colorism does in families, but also how it feels to be special and celebrated because you are a bit lighter than a sibling. Because as children, that must feel wonderful. So at the same time, so you're feeling wonderful about something, and then as you get older and develop a sort of political consciousness, to then realize actually it was wrong that I was praised for something. So it was wrong I was made to feel good and feel better because I'm lighter than a sibling. It's really hard to reach that point and then to try and broach it with family. I think that it's a difficult thing to do. It's important that you're reflecting on that and wondering how you can approach it, but it's very difficult to do, especially if you've got to a political position where the rest of the family perhaps they haven't done the same thinking you've done. It makes it much more challenging then to have a conversation, because it's a painful conversation and it might seem that you're criticizing your family and not everyone wants to hear it. So I think that's very powerful. I think now we should probably move on, and then there'll be another 20-25 minutes to continue talking and discussing after the second part of this talk. So let's move on now to talk about the research project that I've conducted with Dr. Nadia Craddock, who's at the University of the West of England in Bristol. So we conducted the research in 2019. So these are some of our preliminary findings. So colorism in the UK. We conducted research with 34 people of colour, 25 women and 9 men. Here I'm going to explore how the men of colour perceived their skin shade and reflected on their experiences of colorism. Masculinity is often overlooked in discussions and research on colorism, so it's really important to foreground it here. We set out to explore the following research questions. How are Black and mixed race men in the UK affected by colorism, and to what extent does colorism affect their sexual desire? So we conducted 9 semi-structured interviews with Black and mixed race men living in the UK between January and July in 2019. Now, some of these were in-person interviews and some of them we conducted online. The average age of participants was 37 years. Ages ranged from 22 to 58. 4 participants were in their 30s, 2 were in their 20s, and 3 were 40 or above. And it transpired that I'm an African Caribbean Black researcher, Nadia's mixed race, and we ended up with 1 mixed race participant who happened to live in Bristol where Nadia was conducting interviews, and I conducted the interviews with everyone else. So I did all the interviews with Black participants and Nadia did the 1 mixed race participant, but that wasn't by design, it just happened that way. 1 participant was a student, others were from public and private sector occupations, including project managers, a doctor, an accountant, a strategy consultant, and a train operator. All identified as heterosexual, although that wasn't a criterion. 1 was married, 1 was in a relationship, 1 was divorced, and the rest were single. 4 identified their ethnic background as Black Caribbean, 4 as Black African, and 1 as Black mixed race, and he had 1 white parent and 1 African American parent. Participants with dark or medium brown skin described being rejected by young women for being too dark or being overlooked in favour of men with lighter skin when they were growing up. Malachi described being rejected by a Black girl with light skin at school who used his skin shade to put him down. He reported that she told him, "You're dark, I don't find you attractive, you're ugly." Bilal also referred to being disadvantaged in the relationship market as a teenager as a result of his skin shade. A lot of the girls were interested in the light-skinned mixed race boy with the blue eyes, fair skin and fine hair. For a period, I was thinking I would have liked to be lighter in order to obtain the women or to obtain the girls, not really because I just liked my skin tone. Now, this is a really important point because what he's saying is he wanted to benefit from the privilege, and light skin meant privilege, rather than him having a feeling about his own skin being inferior in and of itself. It was about the value that he would, the privilege he would gain if he were lighter. And some of the people who bleach their skin make similar points that they want to make themselves lighter because they can benefit financially from it and in terms of their life chances, rather than because they feel that there's something inherently wrong with their skin. Although, of course, there are also those who've internalized colorism and do think that their own skin is very ugly and revolting and want to change it for that reason. So it shows you that the motivations aren't the same for everybody. Malachi gives examples of being subjected to colorist teasing. He explained that Black friends would make jokes such as tar baby, and sometimes they would be really offensive in their language when they talked about him. And they would also hold up something up and say, "That's you." And he gave an example of, this was an online interview, so he gave an example of a jet black blender to give an example. He said he challenges them because he dislikes it when people try to belittle him due to his skin shade. "You are Black. So do you think you're less than anyone? You're less than someone who isn't Black because that's what you're saying. Because I'm darker than you, I'm less than you. Do you think a white man is more than you because you are black and you are a darker skin tone than they are? So what he does is he challenges them and he gets them to interrogate what they're actually saying. And it's a really invalid point. What he's saying to them is, you're criticizing me because my skin is darker, but you aren't the lightest person in the world. So therefore, do you also see yourself as less than? And that must be quite painful to people to have to listen to what he's saying and think about what that means about how they see themselves. So that's his approach to dealing with colorism. Terence said that when he was growing up, his oldest brother, who was lighter than him, always used to make jokes about another brother's dark skin. He said, it would never be directed at me, but I just knew that I was darker than him, i.e. the brother making the jokes. You're left wondering if what you look like is the ideal. That same brother also used to warn him not to stay in the sun for too long, otherwise he'd get darker. And the implication was that dark skin was something negative, something to be avoided. And so that was something quite painful for him when he was growing up, which kind of brings us back to that conversation we were having earlier about colorism within families and how it makes people feel, and how different skin shades within families mean people are positioned differently in hierarchies. Andrew, who described his skin shade as dark brown, said, my skin shade means that I am not attractive enough. Isaiah's view of society, to be lighter is more attractive. Similarly, Terence said, growing up, you just kind of internalize that idea that lighter is brighter, lighter is better. The notion of light skin as an appearance ideal and symbol of attractiveness is not limited to black women then, it also applied to black men. And that's a really important point, because I think some people think it's only an issue really for black women, when it's actually much broader than that. Participants described a skin shade hierarchy in which people with dark skin were at the bottom and those with the lighter skin were at the top. Isaiah argued that the majority of people think that the whiter you are, the better you are, and that everything associated with good things is white, and the blacker you are is associated with bad things, negative things. Participants gave examples of receiving preferential treatment for having light skin, or witnessing the light skin privilege of other black or mixed race men. They also described being subjected to prejudice and discrimination for having dark skin. And that point about the blacker you are is associated with bad things should suggest that having the darker skin exacerbates racism that might already be there. Colorism on top of that exacerbates the negative way in which people of color are treated. Bilal described the skin shade hierarchy. This is how he saw things when he was growing up. He said, East African was seen as the bottom. And one of the reasons I think he explained for this was that due to the famines, there was a lot of stigma about people from East Africa due to class issues and things like that. Followed by West Africans, followed by Black Caribbeans. Then it was mixed race, half white, half African, half white. Then it was half Black, Caribbean, half white. That was the hierarchy growing up. He said that now East African and Somali women are the flavor of the month, and East African women are considered more attractive and fashionable. He said they've got the best of both worlds, the black body and the European features. And I think this brings us back to the definition of colorism at the beginning. So I think he would argue, and as some scholars do, that the features are also an aspect of colorism. So the closer you are to European features, the more privileged you are, and therefore East African women are seen as more attractive, with straighter hair and thinner lips, smaller noses. Some participants discussed the issue of Black people internalizing colorism. Malachi said, the problem is partly to do with us. We are mentally enslaved. For 400 odd years, you were told, that is better, that is nicer, that is more attractive. And we are still facing that problem now. Andrew said, even with my own people, Africans, you see, we grew up in an environment where even we ourselves felt that it was nicer to be lighter. Now, Andrew grew up in Kenya and then moved to the UK later on. He said, I can remember my grandmother making references to lighter people being more beautiful. It's what we are taught from when you're younger. You learn these things. You learn that your skin shade may be a bit too dark or too light. It's all societal attitudes. And that's, again, it reinforces what we've been discussing about the idea of colorism being reproduced in families and children learning from a young age about colorism and it being passed down the generations. What's interesting to note here is that he says you may be a bit too dark or too light, because in colorism we think about the dark penalty, the way in which people are discriminated against for having dark skin. But it's also important to note the impact for those with light skin of being perhaps excluded because of their skin. So if we go back to thinking about what Amandla Steinberg said, she said it's good to recognize privilege, but sometimes it does hurt to feel like I'm not fully accepted by my own community. Where else am I going to go? I live a Black experience. I walk out of my door every day Black, and that's how the world sees me. So she's feeling that she's part of Blackness and at the same time excluded from it. And Stuart Hall's comments about identity and identity being about belonging, but also equally about exclusion. And thinking about the impact of that is really important, because there have been documentaries about colorism from many years ago where people who have light skin have also been saying it's very, very painful to feel that I do not belong, that I'm not accepted. So it's also important to bear that in mind. Isaiah described being subjected to colorism. He also said he had perpetuated it when he was younger. He said, those who were dark, I treated them less than, treated them not as nice. And another participant also said he did the same. While he was subjected to colorism on the one hand, he also perpetuated it on the other. As is common in societies with histories of colorism produced through enslavement and colonialism, Isaiah internalized the negativity associated with dark skin and perpetuated colorism himself. And I think he felt quite ashamed of the fact that he'd done that, but at the same time, it was nice that he felt able to share that experience with us. So Terence, who described himself as a dark-skinned Black man, said, I guess for white people, I know how I'm perceived as a Black man. I always assume that just the fact that I'm darker would exacerbate any of those tropes, like if I'm intimidating or scary. And I think that brings us back to thinking about the criminal justice system and the longer sentences that people with dark skin get for the same crimes, because they are seen as more threatening and they're seen as more violent or more problematic, then they are penalized more than those with lighter skin. Terence captures the ways in which colorism and racism intersect, recognizing that the darker a Black person is, the more they are seen to embody racist stereotypes about Black people. Michael said that his friends with darker skin shades would discuss how the skin shade hierarchy affected their employment prospects. Now, Michael had lighter skin than his peers, and so they would say, oh, you're more likely to get a job than I am because you're a lighter shade, and you're more nearer to what's the acceptable in terms of those who have the power to employ, which tends to be somebody who is white. And I think for him, for Michael, that is, it was a source of tension for his friends that he had lighter skin and they recognized that he was privileged in ways that they weren't. It was a bit uncomfortable for them. I wouldn't go as far as to say they were necessarily jealous, but it did create some tension, I think, in his social circle. Echo described the advantages of light skin in professional context. He said, when you're talking corporate environments, you're more likely to see a lighter skin, in my opinion, a lighter skinned Black man in a corporate environment than you are to see a darker skinned Black man in a corporate environment. So he's talking about his perceptions of the workplace and who gets to have those jobs that have the high salaries, and the fact that colorism in his view is visible there as well. And it's not clear from that statement whether or not he thinks that's due to the recruitment that's at the corporate company stage, or whether it's something that happens earlier due to educational disparities and things like that, but it's still an important point. Junior said, Black men seem to get roles in the media. However, for women, I think they usually go for light-skinned women when they're casting. We've already discussed this quite a bit already, thinking about all of those sitcoms, thinking about the difference between the mothers and the fathers. So Junior's making the same point, that you can be a Black man, but a mixed race woman or woman with light skin is more likely to get a role. Malachi said, first of all, as a Black man, we face a lot of problems, but we need to realize that Black women face more problems than we do. First of all, we are men, so we are treated better. It's a man's world. Women are looked down upon. So being Black and a woman, that's two things against you. You're Black in a white man's world, and you're a woman in a man's world. So I think Black women are treated less. They are the bottom of the pile in the media's eyes. Echo said that his friends preferred white women, and if they did look at women of colour, they were always mixed race women or those with light skin. And he said that in certain contexts that made him feel uncomfortable going out with those friends because he didn't like the way in which they were treating Black women. He suggested that on a subconscious level, his peers have been programmed to think that there's something wrong with Black women. Because if you're willing to dismiss a group of Black women and not let those women know that they're pretty, and you're constantly flocking towards either light-skinned women or just white women, you're telling those other Black women, I don't find you attractive and I don't find you worthy of my time. Bilal said, with a lot of Black men, you haven't really made it, or you're not really successful until you've obtained a light-skinned or fair-complexioned woman. Bilal described having a girlfriend with light skin as a status symbol. He said, as a young boy growing up in London, if you're with a pretty light skin or mixed race girl, you'll get a slap on the back from your peers, and people will be like, you've done well, and you'll feel a sense of accomplishment. Because at that age, I'm not thinking about love or commitment or settling down. It's my own gratification, as well as I want validation and acceptance from my peers. And the light skin and mixed race girl brought status. So there's a lot to unpack in that, because the way in which he's describing mixed race women is very objectifying. They're almost like, they're like objects that are useful to make the young man look good, rather than people in their own right who have their intellect and have personalities. They're just seen as someone to wear on the arm. And so it's important to interrogate that as well. But the idea that having someone with light skin or who is mixed race would lead to your social standing going up helps to explain why it's so important in some people's eyes to prioritize those with light skin, to perpetuate colorism, because it's associated with rewards. So thinking, oh, sorry, I think I went there. Yes, so he's talking about, right, I went two slides there. Malachi gave an example of young Black people expressing a preference for light skin. He said, in our community, it's going on. It's like, you hear people, I like that lighting down there. That lighty is nice. I was watching a video the other day on YouTube with these young boys going to Stratford, and straight away it's this lighter skin and the long curly hair, more towards Latino and mixed race, it's a thing. And so I've repeated this slide here because it's exactly what he's describing. The long curly hair, the lighter skin, the Latino look, mixed race, is exactly the mothers in this show, and some of the daughters as well, as someone else pointed out. They are conforming to that idea of beauty which the young people are seeing, and also perpetuating themselves. So participants also spoke about the value of a dark complexion as Black heterosexual men. They argued that dark skin was symbolic of Black authenticity and therefore a source of pride. For example, Echo said, I've linked being darker with being more African, because that's something that I'm proud of. And there were other participants who also mentioned that they saw dark skin as being authentic and being valued in that way. One participant described it as being powerful. Some participants also described how dark skin was desired by women due to its associations with masculinity, and in some cases it was exoticized. And this was quite an interesting point, because you've got the tall, dark, and handsome stereotypes, and that also meant that sometimes white women or other people of color would be particularly interested in Black men because they were seen to be masculine and they were wanted in that way, but they were objectified in ways that sometimes were very uncomfortable, and sometimes they were treated as objects in ways that they did not appreciate at all. Some men said they desired Black women, and in one case specifically women with dark skin. This seemed rooted in their family histories and identity politics. Echo said that when he was a teenager, his preference was for darker skinned Black women. He said he associated dark skin with being more African, which he described as a source of pride. However, when he went out with someone from South Sudan who had very dark skin, they both were teased quite a lot, which made him feel uncomfortable. So even though he had a preference at the time for women with darker skin, it didn't come without penalties. He was made to feel that there was something wrong with that choice. He was made to feel uncomfortable. And one participant who said he particularly loved dark skin and it was really important to him, and his ideal woman would be a woman with dark skin, also said that he couldn't go out with his ideal woman because he wouldn't feel comfortable with them being subjected to colorism. So while it was his ideal, it was someone he actually was avoiding. He went out with people with lighter skin because he couldn't see himself in public with someone with darker skin. In some Black anti-racist aesthetics, dark skin is valorized as a signifier of the ideal natural Black beauty. So in conclusion, in the research Nadia Craddock and I did on colorism in the UK, participants described the skin shade hierarchy. Men with dark skin were deemed ugly and teased. However, tall, dark, and handsome stereotypes meant that they were also sometimes desired. Women with light skin were seen as most attractive. Women were objectified. Those with light skin were objectified and seen as status symbols, which is, in a way, I haven't mentioned it here, and I don't think it came up in our research, but you can also find that Black women with dark skin can be objectified as a sort of sex objects. There was also sexism and colorism. Women with dark skin were adversely affected by the combination of prejudices, and they were missing out on opportunities as a result. There was a dark skin penalty for Black men. Some of them perceived that there was colorism in the job market, which meant that those with darker skin were at a disadvantage. And as well as all colorism, there was also an effort from some to value dark skin, whether that be their own dark skin, which they saw as a source of pride and a source of, and as a marker of authenticity. But some of them also preferred women with dark skin, or at least Black women. So now let's open up for Q&A and discussion. So it's nearly 6:10. We've got till 6:30. So if you have any questions about our research, then feel free to ask those. But if you want to just continue the discussion we were having earlier about colorism more generally, that's fine as well.
While we're waiting for people, there was another comment about colorism in families and how damaging it is to family members, and the statement that some of us don't recover from the trauma. So Valerie said that it's difficult for people to recover. I don't even know if it's something that you can go to the therapist about, is it?
You can go to therapists about anything, so definitely, definitely you could, yeah. But that's really painful. That's really important to sort of sit with that comment for a minute, because it's a really, really painful comment. I can see it now. Oh, well, no, it's just disappeared. But colorism, just repeat it again. So colorism
in families is very damaging to family members, and some of us don't recover from it.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really painful point. And it's because it's so divisive and it's so painful, and it goes down to the very sort of your sense of being, your identity as a person, someone who's a certain skin shade. It's extremely painful. And if you recognize that either you have, as how you mentioned, been treated better because of your skin shade, or the opposite, you've been treated worse because of it, then it can lead to resentment, and it's very, very painful. That's a very poignant comment.
I think it was a very interesting study in that, in terms of the sexualization of people because of their color. You don't even, I didn't really even think about that when I was thinking of this topic. I was more thinking about skin tone and, long, good hair and all this kind of negative, sort of like the thing that we aspire to. You got to have long hair or good hair, but, being objectified, it's kind of links in with the slavery, this fetishism around Black people and sexuality.
Yes, and I think it's what you were saying there about fetishize is really important. If you think about maybe Twitter, I haven't done this recently, but if you look, I went a few years ago when I was looking at Twitter comments about people with dark skin, people with light skin. There was some, although obviously there's light skin privilege, some of the comments about women with light skin were really vile, even if they were saying the women were beautiful. It were horrible, objectifying, sexist, nasty comments. So yeah, there's a lot to be interrogated, definitely.
There's another comment from Natasha. She says, growing up, Black men seem to always be interested in the light-skinned mixed race women. At college, they bypassed us black darker-skinned girls. It's a shame it's still going on today.
That's another painful comment, and I think, yeah, it's still an issue today. And I noticed the same thing when I was growing up, and it's very painful because there's nothing you can do. Well, you can bleach your skin, but hopefully most people won't go and do that. But beyond bleaching your skin, which is very damaging and unhealthy, what can you do? That's who you are. But to recognize that just because of your skin shade, you're not seen as enough, but also it's a prejudice which is hidden and at the time wasn't really being spoken about, is even worse, because people were aware of, and probably still now are, more aware of racism than they are of colorism. So it's not even an acknowledged issue often, which is very difficult.
There's another comment here. You've got quite a few thank yous for a lovely, fantastic presentation, Aisha. Someone wants to know if you will hold events in the future, and they would like to know more about your research.
So I think Dr. Nadia Craddock and I should definitely be doing a launch event of our research when we're a bit further on with the analysis, because we've done analysis of interviews with men, but we haven't analysed fully the interviews with the women that with whom we've spoken. So we've got a lot more analysis to do, but then I think it'd be great for us to do an event on that. But you can see more about our research, and we'll be releasing more information about that on Twitter. So I think on one of the slides, if I go back, I can show you our Twitter handles, and then you can keep in touch with us and our research that way. Let's just go and find it. But I think this is such an important area, and we were very lucky to have people kindly giving up their time and sharing very rich narratives with us, that there's a lot of material that we'd like to disseminate.
There's another comment here. I found that in my research too. One, I think it's Yulinda, says that she found in her research too, dark-skinned interviewee said all the black men, oh dear, it's gone off. The chat told them. All the black men she knew ignored her as a partner. So it's, you know, as a black person, the black men ignored her as a partner, potential partner.
Those kind of experiences.
Yes, as a black female, she actually found it difficult to get a black man. They didn't want her at all because she was too black. They wanted mixed race or light-skinned women.
I think many black women with dark skin will be aware of that as an issue, and it's very painful because there's nothing you can. I mean, they've even been people talking about the fact that they might not even ever have a partner because they're being ignored. And in dating apps, lots of people express preferences which don't include black women, or they say mixed women are okay but not black women, and so there's a lot of exclusions, and they're very painful because what do you do with that if you're being discriminated against because of racism by most ethnicities, and then people who are the same color as you aren't interested in you because they're also perpetuating colorism? It doesn't leave you very many options.
Wow. Does anybody else want to make a comment? I mean, there's quite a lot of people on this chat. You can either put your comments in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and make a comment.
Yeah, can I ask a question? Yeah, I'm just wondering whether there's any work being undertaken with young people in schools or in colleges, universities around challenging the ideals of colorism. Because I could imagine that some of the issues would also come from teachers as well as peers. And I just wondered whether if anyone knows of any interventions that are taking place.
I don't know of anything that's happening currently in the UK, but I'm putting in a research funding bid for research on exactly that issue. So hopefully we'll get some money, and then Dr. Nadia Craddock and I will do some more research on colorism in schools and looking at those issues, and trying to do some workshops with young people about challenging colorism and thinking differently. So that's what we hope to do, but we need to see whether we get the funding first. But I think it's really important. It's important that it's being done. I remember I approached The Guardian maybe 7 years ago about an article I wanted to write on colorism in the UK. And the comment was, but it's not an issue here, is it? It's something that happens in the US. And I was thinking, this is really missing something really key that is happening here. It's not been explored widely. It hadn't been explored widely at the time, but it didn't mean it wasn't happening. And that was a bit short-sighted. But I think now there's lots of being written about colorism. People are interested in it. As Yulinda's mentioned, people are doing it for their dissertations. There's a lot more focus on the issue now. So hopefully there'll be much more research done, and it's needed.
There's a few more comments in the chat. I find it, Natalie says, I find it sad when I hear black men put down dark-skinned black women, especially when they may have mothers, sisters, and other family members who look exactly the same. Your preference and who you are attracted to is personal to you, but you don't need to put us down to raise others. That's one of the comments.
And I think Natalie's comment is really important to interrogate as well, because people often say, and particularly people on dating apps, what's wrong with me saying I have a preference? It's just what I like I like tea or I like coffee. But the politics inherent in that desire is not interrogated. So why is it that you only want people with long straight hair who are mixed race or lighter? There's a reason for that beyond. It's not just because those are the people you see as beautiful. The reason you might only see those people as beautiful is because of racism and colorism, and that's what's not being interrogated. So I think that yes, it is very sad, as Natalie says, but people need to interrogate their desire more and think about why is it that perhaps you only can see certain things as attractive. And as we talked about already, if you're coming from a family where you're taught what's valuable and what's beautiful, and perhaps that you're not particularly beautiful because of your skin shade or your sister isn't or what have you, then you perpetuate it. You can see why people just say, oh, it's just a preference, as if it's not got history and it's not connected to any prejudice. It's problematic.
And there's somebody called Valerie who says there's a film called Shade. It was released a few years ago about shadeism in the UK. So that's some information for everyone. And people are quite happy that you're doing more research, Aisha.
Fantastic. Yeah. So yeah, Nadia and I are very keen to do more because it's such an important area. And we've both been interested in exploring colorism and recognizing the issue for many years. So we're in a good position to do that research.
I think there's a point here about self-love. Natasha has said that she feels beautiful in her skin, and it's just frustrating to see the pettiness of how people think. Um, Thoughts on that comment?
I think it's sad. I wouldn't necessarily call it petty, because I think when you've been, as we talked about, if your family has been teaching you certain things, it's like people and their ideas around gender. Families are very good at helping people form ideas around the world and their place in it, and so that becomes their understanding of things, and it's therefore becomes really difficult to think differently. So, but it doesn't mean it's any less problematic. And self-love is very important, but it's also very hard, because if you have a particularly negative view on yourself that you've had since you were very little, to do the work required in order to challenge that, to see things differently, it can take many years, and can take a lot of effort, especially when society is telling you that even if it's someone like Nina Simone who's being depicted, she's not good enough to play herself. Imagine Nina Simone wouldn't have necessarily been cast to play herself in her movie about her life, because ideally it would be someone with lighter skin than her. That's the kind of impression we're given by the media, by the film industry, by music videos, that you're not good enough. And so then to have self-love and say I am valuable is very challenging. Important, but challenging.
And there's another comment about trauma, and there are not many psychologists or psychotherapists or psychiatrists that have the competency to support people who are seeking support for this trauma. So that's a statement by Fui. Um, and when we add the negative and dismissive responses Black people, especially Black women, face when they seek a medical treatment, it compounds the problem. So there's a point there about lack of support within the medical profession around issues like this. It's important to seek support from specialist clinicians who have the competency, experience, and training to provide the right support when seeking help to address trauma.
I think that's a really good point as well, because sometimes it can exacerbate issues if you talk to people who don't know they don't understand what you're sharing and can't give it the space it needs and give you the expert advice. I think that Fui's point is very important. Yeah.
And Yolinda says that she's thanking you for the presentation. She said when she did her research, it appeared that there was no one else in the UK knew about it at the time. Academia hardly accepted it as an issue. I had to explain that it was about what it was all about to my lecturers. I would like to keep in contact. She also wants to keep in contact with you. So and another comment about the presentation being very informative and thanking you. And somebody says nothing will change until children are taught about the history of colonialism. this is where it all started. So there's something about education there.
Yeah, and that is an issue right now that's being explored, which is, it's a very contentious issue because of the government's ideas around what is acceptable to be taught in school curriculums, and there's a lot of campaigning going on about broadening the curriculum and making sure that certain Black histories are included. So the issue of colonialism and what children need to know is a very fraught one right now, but it's really important. Young people of all ethnicities need to have an awareness of this country's history and histories of people from many different countries. It's really, really important, and colonialism has built this country, and it needs to be explored and taught. But it's a difficult time with this government, I think.
Just to let everyone know, we've got about 5 minutes left or less. So if there are any burning comments, if you'd like to make them now, or if you put them in the chat, I'll read them out. Right, so I've got a question from Valerie. Do we give space to think about colorism from both aspects? Lighter skinned people also face racism in society. So that's the question.
So I think that's a very good question. I did mention, from using particular Amandla Stenberg as an example of some of the impact of exclusions from Blackness, but the idea of racism, no, people of all skin shades, people of color of all skin shades are subjected to racism. But I think when you talk about racism, that doesn't really refer to a particular skin shade anyway. So I think racism will cover light skin, people with light skin, people with darker skin, but colorism, often the focus is on the dark skin penalty, because that's what separates someone who might be mixed race from someone who's Black, is the fact that their skin shade is darker, so that exacerbates racisms. But when you talk about racism, it's not specifically racism towards people with dark skin or light skin, it's to do with all people. So racism towards those who have lighter skin is included in discussions and campaigning and work around racism anyway, and it is an issue. I think it's good you've raised that point, because I think some people don't acknowledge that, and that's very painful. Just like the actress Amanda Steinberg was talking, people see me as Black when I leave the house, she said, and therefore she will be subjected. And we had participants, mixed race women participants, who talks about vile racism to which they were subjected in rural parts of the country. Really awful racism, worse than I would experience here in London, although I have much darker skin shades than they do. And I think that isn't always acknowledged, because people talk about light skin privilege, then it can be forgotten that even if you have light skin, if you're in the wrong kind of part of the country or just in general, you can be still subjected to horrible racism, and that's not given space. So I think I'm glad you raised that point, Valerie. Thank you.
And just before we go, we just want people to know that the recording of the event will be available at newhamblackhistory.org. So if you want to see this recording, then you just go onto the newhamblackhistory.org website.
Okay, well, I'd like to say thank you to Newham Council for inviting me to do this talk. I've really enjoyed it. And also thank you to everyone who's shared their comments. They've been really valid, really valuable and rich comments that have helped us to get this discussion flowing and to think about things in different ways. I think that's really important. So thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge, Aisha.